Can you tell me your name?
My name is Princetta Hadley Greene.
And where do you live, Mrs. Greene?
I live at 112 Crestwood Drive, Thomasville.
I understand that your family's been in Thomas County for a long time?
Yes, my father was, well, he was born on the border of what was at that time was Thomas and Leon, I believe. Grady County wasn't in existence. He was a slave. Well, he was born as a slave parent, and it's at the time of his birth, his mother was a slave. She worked in the home of the slave owner.
What were their names? Do you know?
Well, as the family that passed the message to me, it was my father's father, who was supposed to have been Simon Hadley.
And who owned him?
Well, he was the slave owner. He owned a lot of slaves. You know, at that time, you know, the blacks were half white, and that was he. And well, he lived there until he became of age. I imagine must have been around 20 or something. And he got married to Agnes Meeks, his first wife. And they moved to our Pleasant home in the home plantation.
What year were they married?
Well, I don't recall the year, but he purchased some property in 1876, and he was able to cure the deed to this property in 1879. No, 1889. I believe that it was either 1879 or 1889. And it's on the deed, you will see it when you see. And well, to that family, there were several children born. And of course there were some of my sisters that were born out of wedlock before he married this wife, Agnes. I believe there were 5, and Agnes and he, they had 15 children.
Altogether?
Just he and his wife. And of that family, of that group, there were 2 sets of twins. And of course, she died, and my mother, she became the wife of my daddy.
And what was your mother's name?
Her name was Lucille Reed Hadley.
And she was from Thomas County?
She was from Thomas County. She lived out of what is now the Remington Avenue, that area out in there.
Right.
She was born somewhere between there and Pavo, I believe. And it's near where Dr. Reed, you know where Dr. Reed is? Well, that's where she was born and reared. And she married my father. I don't recall the year, but it was in 1890 something that they got married. And to their union, it was 7 of us.
I see.
So I had 7, my mother had 7 children.
So 22 children altogether, from the first marriage and then the second?
Well, he had 5 before we was ever married.
I see.
And his first wife, so there were 27.
27 children.
I'm supposed to be the 27th child. You get
the baby.
Yeah. And all of them are passed on now. And let me see what else you want. Well, Mom and my daddy had purchased the 250 acres of land. He
now,
was
how did he
buying that, and his father gave him something to start with.
I see.
And he and his children purchased that. And after Mama and he married, they bought more property. I have the deeds for that. And of course, I don't have one of the deeds. I couldn't get it right then because it's up in there, and I have it in my locker.
I see.
But anyway, he and Mama purchased this land, and about, I believe it's in according to the record I have there, 1905, he divided what he and his first wife had purchased to those children.
I see.
And then they purchased some more. Mama and he bought this. And about 2 years before he died, they started buying some more. And he gave all of us a little strip.
When did your daddy die?
He died in 1910. I was born in the year he passed.
What did his experience with slavery, was he?
Well, according to my mother's record, she said he was too small to work.
I see.
And being in the home of it, and his mother was a cook, he carried water to the people who worked. That's what she and my elder sisters would tell me about his life. And he never worked as a slave, but he...
And what did his daddy do?
His daddy was an overseer. Had, the part of the plantation was his. And he had several people that worked for him.
I understand. And so at the conclusion of the war, he later bought property.
He did buy this property. Now, on those deeds, you will see where he bought his first property. And I don't have the deed to the seconds, but I do have the two deeds there that he bought with my mother.
I see.
I think one was in 1905 or 1902, one was 1903 or 4. It was in those years that he purchased, and so they paid for it. And just before he passed, as I've said, he purchased another 100 acres. And he
must have been a very successful farmer.
He was. His father had left him a lot of little things to kind of go along with. He had, well, at that time we called it the shoe horse. The way it was a blacksmith, similar to a blacksmith, where they shoed the horses, and he had a cotton gin where they ginned the cotton, and they had to use mules to operate it. That was some of his father's product that he was able to have. And of course, he had other like cane mills, for grinding sugar cane. And well, we had a big farm. When I got large enough to, to know there were 5. They had 4 mules and 1 horse, and they called it a 5-horse farm.
I see. And that was a big deal then.
Well, then he had all those children see to work. And after some years after that, he. Well, my father had passed, but my mother and those operated. Well, the time kind of got rough with them.
It did. That would have been in the 20s?
Yeah, that was in the 20s.
What caused the hard times?
Well,
the boll weevil
depression, I guess, and you know what I mean, people weren't getting much for their products and things. And they just had to give the farm up. They carried it as long as they could. And one of my brothers kept going, but the others, they moved away, and some of them got jobs at the plantations. And, well...
And Pebble Hill was one of those?
One of the Pebble Hill and St. Cola were the places where my brothers worked. They tried to hold the farm a while because they would work during the farming season when we were planting and gathering, but during the summer months they worked on the plantation. And they couldn't get money. I've heard them say they wouldn't let them borrow from the bank they couldn't get much money from the bank. And that was one of the reasons why they had to cut the farm. And their families were growing large. And 2 of my brothers moved away.
And where did they go?
One went to New York and the other one to Philadelphia.
And what did they do there?
Well, this one that went to New York, he went in the armed services, and of course that was close to near World War II. But my oldest brother, he went there too. That was up in the years after he'd gone. I believe after World War. Let me see, it was before World War II, between World War I and I. Well, anyway, he went to educate his children. He wanted to have his children educated, and he said he couldn't do it with the farm and the little monies he would get from the plantation. But he had taken a course from the Franklin Auto Company, I believe it was Franklin in Philadelphia, and he was able to work as a mechanic. And he went to Philadelphia and got a job there, and he was able to send his children on. Some of them went to college, and then others, all had a trade, see.
Where did your brother get his love of education? What made him think in those lines?
He was very good at fixing old cars at home. I can recall when I was quite a child before he left, people would just come to our house with their trucks and just only a few people had cars back in those days, and they would bring them for him to fix. And his brother-in-law was living in Philadelphia, and he got some information about this school there, and he took this course through mail, and he got a diploma for it, and after so long he moved out.
That's good.
And let me see what else.
What about your other brothers and sisters, or even yourself?
All right, the older ones, they all married away, and well, most of them lived out there only for the old my half sisters lived out on their farms, the property that my father had given them. They moved out. They lived out on theirs, on their farm, and my whole sister, she got married, and she lived in the city. And let me see now, that I left one brother that was stay at home other than. And he married and was the one that went to the army. He went to. I had one brother to go to World War I, and
how did he serve?
He served about 2.5 years.
And what was his position?
His position, I believe, was what was it? I know it was above the private. And what's the next step?
A corporal?
He went above that. A sergeant, corporal, that was called. And this other brother was a sergeant. The one that was in World War II, he was a sergeant. And the older brother that went to World War I was a corporal. And he was his family did what they could to help carry on. And he lost both of his wives. He had 2 wives. He lost his first wife during that World War time. Time as he was in the army, and the second wife passed between the times. I think it was about in 30-something. The second wife passed. What
kind of education was available early on?
We had elementary. There was a school. It's called Clockness Elementary School, and it carried you through 6th grade, I believe, because my sisters and older brothers, sisters and all of them went to Beachton.
I see.
This was a school supported by the American Missionary Association.
Right.
And it took you through the 8th. And they went there to school. But
and what about after the 8th grade? Was there anything available?
Well, they didn't go any farther. That was about the highest of all. Most of my sisters and brothers, I was the only one who was able to finish high school and
where did you
college.
go?
I went to Alabama Industrial School.
And where to college?
In Albany State.
What were your degrees in?
A.B. degree in elementary education.
Very good.
And I had some studies at Florida A&M, but I didn't get my master's.
When did you graduate with your
I graduated, in 1950. I had to practically get mine in bits because my mother she became feeble, and I had to work. I taught after I got an normal certificate from Alabama, but I didn't get a degree until 1950 from Albany State.
And you taught in Thomasville?
Yes, I retired at East Side.
I see. So you taught from 1950 until you retired?
Oh, no, I taught before that. I started working well after high school. I finished high school in 1932.
I see.
And then I went to summer school. I had a little certificate that you could work with the lower elementary grades from Alabama, and then I would go to summer school until I was able to get my 3-year.
I see.
And after I got 3 years, I got married. My husband sent me back for a year, and I was able to get my degree.
That's great. And so you taught elementary school?
Oh, yes, elementary.
At Eastside?
At Eastside.
And was that the only school
no,
in Thomasville?
That was the only school I taught in Thomas. Oh, no, I taught at Dunlap. I'm sorry. I taught at Dunlap until the integration, and then they moved us in different areas, and I was placed at Eastside.
All right. How was integration in terms of education? Was it smooth, or were there problems associated with that?
You mean with the integration of schools? Well, it wasn't quite as smoothly as it could have been. One thing, they had us, we had to go into the schools and observe the white teachers. but they didn't have them to come to observe us. And I thought that was one thing that wasn't so pleasant in my feelings. You know, I don't know about the others, but we had to observe. Each teacher had to go in a room and observe the teacher. And, well, we came back to meet our reports of what we...
And how long a time did you observe? Did you go in
Well, I went one day. I think each of us had one day to go, if I can remember that now. I believe that was it.
And was it a class, if you taught 4th grade, then you observed a 4th grade
Well, yeah,
class?
whatever grade that they assigned you to. Well, I was teaching 5th grade, and I was looking, but I didn't get into the 5th grade classroom. I went into 6th grade, and that was a Miss Kelly, who was the lady I observed, observed during that time. And well, you know, teaching is teaching, and everybody got their methods and ways of doing it. And children are children, and so, because I never understood why that was done, but it was done. And of course, I didn't question it, though.
What year did integration come to the schools?
I believe it was in 71. 70. It was 1970. 1970.
All right.
And I retired after 3 years working.
73. What was life like in the city during the Depression? I understand that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm told that life was harder for blacks in town than it was for blacks who lived on plantations. Is that right?
Well, that was really true about that.
Tell me about that.
I can tell you, I never lived on the plantation now, because I lived at the time I was living on my daddy's. But we were so close to it, and we had to, well, the school that I attended was on the plantation, and we were exposed to a lot of things. Now, the people on the plantation lived well.
How was that?
They had nice homes, and they had a job. Even the children, if they were old enough, could get work to do during the summer. And they had transportation for them. Well, there was a Mrs. Hadley who had I guess you call it a station wagon. Anyway, she would bring the children in, then some of the parents would bring them into those who had finished elementary school. And the kids they had a really good living, I could say, and they even had moving picture. They had a place for a theater for the kids, and the shows that would show here, they would have them out there the next night.
I see.
Sometimes they would be going back and forth during the time and bringing in the pictures. And, well, they had a good time. Yeah.
What kind of jobs did blacks have on the plantations during, say, the Depression era?
Well, there were carpenters, brickmen. There were, well, my brother, as I told you, he was one of the mechanics. He worked up there during his time. They had mechanics, and well, there were milkmen because they had dairies, and of course the plantations had farms too. You know, and some of them worked on it. Whatever they were capable of doing, I think they got jobs as they were prepared.
So the plantations were fairly self-sufficient then, weren't they?
Very much so, and they were very, very good to the people. A lot of those who lived on some of the people in the rural there sold their homes and went and lived on the plantations. I know several families that did it.
And did they feel they were better off having made that decision?
Now, I talked with one man, well, it's not been very long ago. He said that his father sold his property because he just couldn't operate the farm, and he had to have a steady job. And, you know, things were so rough, I'd say.
Right.
He couldn't support his family, and he was getting an income that he was sure of, see. And so he just sold his farm.
And moved out to the plantation?
And moved on the plantation. It was around in that era, too.
Well, what about blacks in town? What was their experience during the Depression?
Well, my experience, I tell you, when I came to town, I was 6th grade then. I lived with my brother, and I was going to school. And what I could observe about seeming that the children, well, I have to talk about the children because they had a kind of rough go of it.
How was that?
Well, many of them had to go to the rural to work, after, you know, if they weren't like during the summer. Now I know my brothers and those would get several children and grown-ups too to come out and work in the fields. And some of them were working maybe in canning plant and other little things they had around here in town, but they seemed to have had a rough go, where most of us didn't hardly go to the field. You know, we would do a little bit, but we could get a lot of folks that and didn't have to pay them very much.
What were the wages during the Depression? Did it differ from the plantation to, say, the city?
Well, I couldn't tell you about that so much, but I know one thing. A lot of people from town came out on the plantations and worked. Now, to whether it was they were getting more for what they did, I wouldn't know exactly, but...
Did they live in town and come to work? Or
some of them lived in town and came,
then others
some... Now, those like maids for the...
big house?
Yeah, they lived. They had a place called Waldorf. It was a cottage for the helpers, and they lived out there. Of course, there were some who commuted, but most of them lived out. And they had the chauffeurs who... They had home, well, she built a home for some of the chauffeurs and those who had their large families. And one of my brothers was one of the chauffeurs, so they built him a house for his family.
I see.
He left I don't know, because he had to come over there to work. And, well, his house burned down. That was one thing. His house burned down, so he moved over on the plantation. And he was a chauffeur for a long time.
That's neat. Tell me about the May 20th celebration. I've heard a lot about that.
Now, when I was quite young, that was kind of independent. You know what I mean? That was done more or less by the blacks that lived around a Clockney community. And I can only tell you about where they would gather every year and have a big spread, we called it, a feast like. And they had games, they played it. But now the ones that they had on the plantation, they started that after I left, you know, and started to Al-Anon. I mean, after I was 6th grade. But I can recall when in my my early years, they would have people who maybe had some type of instruments like a drum or guitar, and they'd have dancing and just have a good time.
And this was in the celebration
of
freedom?
That was supposed to be in celebration of freedom.
How did the word arrive here that the slaves were free? Did your mother ever tell you?
Yeah, she said, well, she didn't tell me exactly how the word got, but she said that was it was on May the 20th that they supposed to have found. In some areas, it was the 28th of May.
In Tallahassee, it was the 28th.
That's what she would tell us. But now, just how it came, I don't know whether they somewhat announced it. But I do remember I was small in World War I in. But I can remember some of it, you know, but not very much. But there was a man who was called a Rayberg. It was, I believe he was the sheriff at that time. But anyway, she said that he came through the community, and you making a knot with a bell, ringing a bell, the war has ceased, the war has ceased. And that sort of thing like that.
Is it still celebrated today?
No, I don't think they, maybe in some areas, but I don't think they have it out there at Beverly Hill.
Pretty much died out?
I think it has. I don't know of any. Maybe somebody else, but I haven't heard of doing it since quite a long while.
Well, I thank you very much for talking with me. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Well, I am Lucille Morris. I live here in Thomasville. My address is 308 West Calhoun Street.
I'm Sadie Gibson, and my address is 400 West Calhoun Street.
Mrs. Murray?
I'm Ornatha Wright Murray, and my address is 437 East Jackson Street.
Oh, I'm awfully pleased to have you all here today. And Seal, I believe we'll start with you.
Okay.
I know of your interest and involvement with education, and I'd like to talk with you about education for blacks in Thomas County.
As it used to be?
As it
Where
used
do you
to
want to
be.
begin, Nancy?
With your daddy.
Oh, with my father?
Because he was very
Okay.
influential.
Well, my father was a great advocate for education. He's very interested in education. I grew up, this might be of interest to our listeners, I grew up in Grady County. At the time when I was a youngster, there were public schools, but they were not very well financed.
And these were schools for blacks?
Yes, these were schools for blacks. I attended the Grady County Training School at Beachton. The county of Grady, at that time, I was told, I was a youngster, supplemented the teachers' salaries, but the American Missionary Association did much towards providing some of the facilities that we used. And parents also supplemented with their in-kind services. I remember several gentlemen who used to bring wood in the winter. We had a, what do you call that, pot-bellied stove in our classrooms. The Grady County Training School was a very good school.
When did that close?
Excellent teachers. When did Grady County Training School close? Nancy, I can't be exact. I can't be exact as far as a date is concerned. But Grady County Training School really merged, I guess, in the 30s with the county school system. The county,
I see.
As times went on, the county started assuming more responsibility for black education. And it must have been around the 30s that the county really started taking over education in Beachton, Georgia, where I was born.
What about your daddy? Let's hear
my
about him.
daddy. My daddy, if I had, well, at that time, I didn't realize what a valuable human being he was. When a person is young, he wants to be the richest person in the world, and you always look at your folks and, oh, if I were the only child, I could have everything in the world I wanted. There were 5 of us. And I always thought my daddy wasn't able to give me all the things that I wanted, but as I grew older, I realized that having my father as a father during those years, that was in the late 20s, I could not have had a better Jim, because he was interested in education. His value system, as I compare the value systems now among so many people, would have gotten an A+.
Tell me where
Yes.
you were living then.
I was living at Susina Plantation.
And what was your daddy's position?
My daddy was the head chef at Susina Plantation, and that's a long story. My daddy met the Masons. The Mason family owned Susina Plantation, which you have perhaps heard about. Have you ever been to Susina?
Oh, many times.
Okay. Very beautiful place, isn't it?
It certainly is.
Yes. Well, I grew up in those woods, and it was just like living in fairyland to me at that time, because we had all of the advantages of education, really. As much education took place in my home and at Susina as it did at school, I can imagine.
Now, why was that?
Because my daddy always provided a library for us.
And why was that important to him?
That was important to him because, as a youngster, he went to Philadelphia. And, of course, he went to Philadelphia as a worker with the Masons. They were very, very good, prominent people at that time.
And what was the year, or about the year, do you know?
Oh, my gosh. My daddy told me he went to Philadelphia around in the 1890s, somewhere around
That'd be about
that
right.
time. Yes, about the 1890s, just around the turn of the century, you see. And while in Philadelphia, he worked in the Mason household, and he was always interested in education. I think Mrs. Greene mentioned the fact that the Beachton School went to 6th grade.
Yes.
Okay. It seems to me, from hearing so many folk who said they finished 6th grade, that 6th grade was the apex.
Mm-hmm.
You see, blacks went to about the 6th grade. My daddy went to 6th grade.
And those were the expectations?
Those were the expectations. And, of course, he had the basics. it was amazing how he had acquired such interest in education, having gone only 6 years. And so his education continued when he went to Philadelphia. A little old boy coming from Beachton, Georgia, going to Philadelphia, that was just like going to MIT, even though he was working as a domestic. Most of the persons with whom he worked were people from Ireland and Germany, the cooks and the maids, etc. And he learned a whole lot of things while he worked in Philadelphia. Of course, he returned to Thomasville. The Masons returned to Thomasville. They've never been to Thomasville, I guess. But anyhow, they finally settled in this community. And my dad continued working with them. And upon one of his trips to Philadelphia, he was able to hear a live debate between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. And of course, during that period in history, they were the great voices of what education should be like for blacks.
And two divergent points of view.
Two divergent points of view. And of course, the view listened to by most whites at that time, of course, was Booker T. Washington. Because most people felt that education for the Negro should certainly be for vocational purposes, mainly trades and domestic work and that kind of education.
Which was something that the Freedmen's Bureau back in the 1860s advocated, was teaching apprentices a trade.
Right, yes. And of course, as I look back and read the history of that period, I can imagine that it made sense to advocate a kind of education which was kind of compatible with those people in power. Because if you advocated another kind, strictly academic, you wouldn't have gotten any cooperation. But it was good that there was a different philosophy
Another
to
voice.
challenge that particular one, and it was offered by Du Bois. He believes that Negroes should cultivate their minds. And he thought that if they only concentrated in the trades, that soon they would be exploited. And of course, Booker T. Washington did make many, many advancements with his philosophy. But before he died, he discovered that perhaps this was not the way, because his advocacy did very little to stop lynching, to stop exploitation. And he finally, before he died, made statements which showed that he regretted that he didn't lean more toward the academics. But I think he was wise. Before he died, he did advocate both academics and industrial education, academic education and industrial education. You can take a look at Tuskegee Institute now, Tuskegee University, and see the advances that it has made. It not only teaches agriculture, but you have schools of engineering, etc. All of the areas are emphasized at Tuskegee Institute. Now back to my daddy. Because of the influence that those two men had on his life, he was determined to achieve his goals through as many of his children who would take advantage of it. And I think that I was one of those persons whom he felt he had convinced that education is what I want y'all to have. And every time he'd bring a book to the library, I would read it. We had our own little library in the living room.
And was that unusual for that day and time?
Well, it was, I guess, unusual for black families. Perhaps it was.
What kinds
Not
of
for
books?
all black families. Nancy, believe it or not, I have one of the first books my daddy put in that library. What every young girl should know. He had all girls. Copyrighted 1912. Yes. And of course we had the classics, as many as he could get. Many of those books were given him by Mrs. A. Hayward Mason. She was the matriarch of the Mason family.
And a Quaker.
Yes, a Quaker. And she was as avid in her determination to see that as many people as possible became educated as my daddy was. And of course, I don't want to give her all the credit for motivated my father because he was as avid in his educational advocacy as she was, perhaps more so, because he felt that education was the only way that black people could really make it. And I'm so proud that he was my father.
And he had a great deal of influence here in that regard, didn't he?
Yes, in Beachton. My daddy lived in Grady County. He influenced a whole lot of families to send their kids to school. It makes me feel very good when I run into some of the young people who grew up at Beachton during my lifetime, when they tell me that Mr. Glenn influenced me so much. He would always give me books when I came to his house. One of those persons is Jimmy Jones, who owns JB's.
Yes.
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 He says that my daddy was the inspiration of his life as far as education was concerned. Daddy used to give them National Geographic magazines. He'd give them old newspapers or whatever he had to say, now you take that and read it and bring it back to me. My daddy loved newspapers so much that he wouldn't throw them away. Guess where he'd put them? Under the house. He would. And anybody who came to the house when he was available, he worked much. When I say, he didn't work most of the times, but he worked on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, because, you know, a cook has to be on the job a whole lot of hours. But he spent most of his leisure hours talking to his children and reading to his children.
That's great.
And I was just a little girl
Well, let's
then.
talk about the advances that blacks have made.
Okay. I think blacks have made tremendous advances. When you look at some of the obstacles that they had, it's just absolutely amazing. It's incredible how blacks have overcome. I must say, however, in the little community where I was raised, at Beachton community, there were other influences that were impacting on blacks' progress. We had the Evergreen Congregational Church, which was connected with the church in Thomasville, the Bethany Congregational Church, both sponsored by the American Missionary Association. And we never had a minister in our pulpits who was not a well-prepared person. He was either a graduate of Talladega College or Fisk University, all of which were AMA schools. And missionaries would come to our community during the summers, and they taught Bible school, and we had arts and crafts and all kinds of activities at the church. And let me tell you, Nancy, we lived about 2 miles from the church, but we walked to church, and we walked to school. And now that I have grown, I've grown up, I realize that that was really good for us to walk to and from school. When it rained, my dad would hire somebody to pick us up. And by the way, my daddy sacrificed so much to take care of his 6 children. Do you know my daddy never owned an automobile? Never owned an automobile. He said he could not own an automobile and save enough money to send us to school. He sent us to boarding high school. He sent 3 of us to boarding high school.
And where was that?
Fort Valley. Mr. Henry E. Hunt was the principal of Fort Valley Normal and Industrial School. And my dad thought he was a great man. That was during the Roosevelt era that he heard about Henry Hunt. Henry Hunt was one of those persons who believed in the education of blacks. He was an Episcopalian, and Fort Valley was an Episcopal school.
That's great. I've got a list here provided by Mrs. Greene with a list of ministers. Maybe you all can tell me about some of these ministers. There's Reverend Frank Martin from the Providence Methodist Baptist Church. Missionary Baptist Church. Or a Reverend King from New Jerusalem Baptist. Were you familiar with those names? A Reverend Broadnax or a Reverend Davis?
I've heard of Reverend Broadnax. He was
one of those 2 hours a
First Baptist Church
child
leader.
when they were ministers here.
Yeah.
But I remember Reverend Broadnax, that name, Reverend King, and also Reverend Martin. And
And
I
were
was a
they-
young girl.
Were they educated ministers? Do you know?
Yes.
Well, I think they were. Yeah. They had finished high school. They were educated ministers. And they were leaders in the community. They used to have a ministerial association here of ministers, and then Father Perry's time, and Reverend Rulak's time, and Reverend Martin too, and all those men were members of that ministerial alliance.
And when was that, Mrs. Murray?
I guess that must have been back then, in the 20s.
And
In
were
the
the-
20s and 30s, right,
And the ministers
Yes,
were community leaders?
Yes,
Is that
that's
correct?
right, very much so, right.
How did they influence the black community or lead the black community?
Well, they encouraged them to get an education. They encouraged them to stay out of trouble. They encouraged them to get jobs and to work and to not be hanging around in the street. And Reverend Rulak started our first Bible school here. And that was when I was a young teenager, 11 and on up. And children from all over town came to the Bible school, and then the other children. But the other ministers started having Bible school too. And that would keep us out of trouble during the summer and have a place to go and get religious training. And it made a close-knit community, although blacks lived in different areas of town.
Where did blacks live in the 20s and 30s here?
They lived in Totwatton. They lived where the Thomasville High School is now. That was Hansel Street, Spear Street, Mitchell Street, and the Presbyterian Church was down there. They lived on the other. They lived in Deacles Quarter.
Now, where was Deacles Quarter?
Deacles Quarter is over there on the lower end of Calhoun Street.
Why was it called Deacles Quarter? Do you have any idea?
I really don't know unless Mr. Deacon used to own property over there. That's probably why they called it Deacon's Quarter.
Well, where was Dewey City?
Dewey City was over there where Douglas Middle School is now.
And why was it
Dewey
called
City.
Dewey City? Do you know?
No, I never knew why it was called. Do you know why?
Do you
No,
know?
I don't, but
I don't know
you
why
should
it
know,
was-
Mrs. Gibson.
Yeah.
Your question?
Why was it called Dewey City?
Why was it called Dewey City?
I really don't know why it was called Dewey City, but that section was that's where our first school was. That was run by the city,
And what was the name of that school?
the Dewey City School.
The Dewey City School. Is that building still standing?
Yes. Let me tell you a little bit about that. In the 1900s, the blacks went to a little school that was located on Clay Street, across the street from the Western Y. And they had 5 or 6 teachers that took care of it. They had a shop or some kind of thing that they taught children how to make things or how to grow things, where the Western Y is. That's across the street.
Where their tennis court is
The
now?
location of the first school was on the corner of Clay Street and Pine Street.
Yes, ma'am.
About 1901, I think, that the city took over. They built the school out in Dewey City, and about somewhere between 1 and 5, they moved from the Clay Street to the Dewey City School.
I see.
And that is where I grew up, in the Dewey City School. I went first grade there, and I went all the way on through up to 10th grade. And for years and years and years, the school didn't have any more than 10th grade. in every class that came to the 10th grade. They had a commencement exercises and all of that. But the students who wanted to go on further, some of them went to the Normal School, and some of them went to schools that were colleges, but they had what they called demonstration school.
Now, what was a demonstration school?
The demonstration was at many colleges. Now, I went to Spelman College, and
When was that?
I think that was 1922, and I went to Spelman College. And of course, the 10th grade was not up to par. You're not having everything that you'd have. And so I began in this demonstration school at the 10th grade and went on through to graduate in high school. And of course, I had been there 3 years and accustomed to everything. So graduating, I went on from there to college. And I spent 4 years there. So my total number of years there was 7. And my mother, my father passed when we were all small. There were 4 of us. And I know very little bit about my father, just his name and that's all. But my mother was very determined that we should get an education.
And why was that important to her?
So she was, well, she had a 2-cent job. At that particular time, she was a cook.
And where was she a cook?
She was cooking for a white family. And she had, I guess she had been with them 5 or 6, 10 years. And the salary was nothing. She had to cook 3 meals a day, go back and fix the dinner and everything. And I remember very distinctly that she used to have to go back and milk the cow. Because they had a cow that... Now that house is located where just off of Warren Avenue. I think they use that for the bank, I think. That's where my mother worked for these 10 or 12 years until everybody in the family began to die and move out. And of course, with that little thing, that little bit of money that she had, that family was very good to her. We lived in a house where we were born. And that house, we tore that down. It is behind that shoe store on Smith Avenue. And that's where I grew up, in that house. And the family was very good to us. We had lamps. Every day we had to wash the lamps, covers. So they had our house wired. And we had lights. And we children were just so excited over the fact that we had lights. And we got more whipping about just turning on all the lights. Everywhere, on the porch, everywhere. And then we'd get out, stand up and look at our house. Look at our house with lights.
Well, her experience is no different than so many of us. I remember when we had to wash those lamp globes.
And,
These were kerosene lamps.
Yes, kerosene lamps.
another thing, we had to do our washing and ironing. And when we did our washing and ironing, we always had a fireplace. And we put the irons in front of the fire to heat them. And then we would do our ironing. And so this woman who had given us she gave it to us, the electricity, gave us an iron. And I just ironed away. And I remember one time I was doing a lot of talking and ironing and hit my arm. Had a big scar on the iron. I forgot the iron. It was not the not the smoothing iron we used to call it. Well, then of course I made it through college. I had my teacher, one of my teachers, her daughter, we were good friends, and she told me when we graduated, both of us, from 10th grade, she wanted us to go to Spelman. And I said, oh my goodness, I don't know how I can go to Spelman. You're going to have to pay. And so she said, well, I could work it out so that you could go. And so, of course, she helped to get me in Spelman. And I had a job. And my first job was running errands for the office. Next job, the next year, maybe I had another job. I had to work in the kitchen. And one of my jobs was to cut the bread. And they had something like this that you cut the bread for the table. And well, I don't know what I was doing, but anyway, I cut my fingernail half. Then I had to go to hospital. And they had to freeze my finger to get the top part off, and then the other part grew in. But that didn't stop me from that job, because I knew I didn't have enough money to take care. But you know, at that particular time, and you look at Spelman College and all the other colleges now, the tuition was $14 a month. The room and board was $20-some. And I look back on that and said, I just wonder, how did the college
Make it.
succeed? Because they had plenty of kids
Well, I know
who were
one
doing
of
the
the ways.
same thing that I was doing, working.
Yeah.
And that was work and no money, but work. Well, anyway, I managed to, I don't know how my mother did it, but I went into that college, and they had a plan that they called 5-4. And that meant that if you could not get everything that you needed in 4 years, you could get it. Whatever you're working now, these are for the workers, you could take another year to get it. But somehow now that the good Lord was with me, and my senior year, my mother said, I'm not going to let you work this year. I was the happiest thing in the world. I was so happy. I didn't know what to do.
This brings up
She said,
another issue.
you better be getting good grades now. You've been doing fine with all that work that you've been doing.
Don't you go up there and play?
Miss Gibson was wondering where did the money come for operating these schools at that time, you know. There were many white philanthropists from the North. The Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, numerous other foundations. The Roosevelt Foundation that helped to support black colleges financially.
Right. Well, now Spelman was well supported.
Yeah. Rockefeller.
They were the school, after it was organized, 2 white women came to Atlanta, and they wanted to do something for the women, because they were not being educated. They started, and this teacher that I was telling you about, started in her father's church basement. And they stayed there until they could finally get the grounds where Spelman is now.
Okay.
Now, the Rockefellers, from the very beginning, supported that church, that school. And ever since then, it never had any deficit. At that time, the school had been called a seminary. And the year that I went in, it was changed to college. And they had groups of students who didn't, or who felt that they were not able to do the 4 years. They had a 2-year thing for those. And then those who wanted to try to go on went on through for the 4 years. And I was so happy when I graduated. I asked my mama if she's going to come up. She said, "Child, I put all my money in this."
Interestingly,
I put all my money in trying to keep you in school. And I'm so happy you graduated. So you just come on home.
interestingly, Nancy, Ornatha's father was the architect for the Grady County Training School.
He was?
Yes, he was an early graduate of
Yeah.
And he was a graduate of Spelman?
No,
Tuskegee.
my father and mother were graduates of Tuskegee Institute.
Tuskegee.
And
Now,
my mother, they were during the time of Booker T. Washington and George Washington Carver.
were they from Thomas County?
No, they weren't from, they came here from Tuskegee.
I see.
And they married in 1914. I was born in 1918. And I guess they must have come to Thomasville maybe right after they married. And they lived with one of these nurses, this Miss Retta Heath, that was an early nurse here in Thomasville. And then they bought this property on East Jackson Street, and my father helped build this house. But he was an architect and a brick mason.
What other buildings did he build, Mrs. Murray? Do you
Well,
recall?
here he built the church on the corner of Jones and Fletcher Street. I can't think of the name of that church to save my life. And he drew the plans and built a house on West Clay Street for Miss Berta McLeod. It's still there. But he couldn't get too much work here as an architect. Now, he and the other brick masons built those barns at Miss Pance's when she was building the barns on Pebble Hill for
Pebble
her
Hill.
cows and things. They built those barns out there.
Who else worked with your daddy in building those
Mr.
barns?
Fletcher, Mr. Guy Hadley, James Gary, and Mr. Adams. All those were early brickmen. Marshall Ford, they were Thomasville people.
Was that Mr. Henry Adams?
Mr. W.E. Gibson.
And Mr. Gibson, right, Mr. Sadie's father-in-law,
And
right,
he was
Mr.
a
Gibson, right.
concrete finisher, isn't that
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, right, Well, those men, they all
Was that
worked
Mr. Henry
together there.
Adams?
Yes,
Okay, yes, I know him.
And so my daddy had to leave and get work out of town, and I remember doing that hurricane in St. Petersburg, that was in the 30s. He went down there and did a lot of work and drew plans for churches and homes that were destroyed during that time.
And give me your daddy's name.
His name is James E. Wright. They call him Jim Wright.
And where was
James
he?
E. Wright Sr. He was from, originally from Brunswick, Georgia.
I see.
You see, he went to Tuskegee, and that's where he met my mother. My mother was born in Tuskegee.
And your mother's name was?
Celestine Hamilton.
I have the architectural drawing of the Evergreen Congregational School that he built.
I'd love to see that.
Yes, in 1911.
Now, what brought your daddy and mother to Thomasville?
I don't know how. I guess they were looking for a place to live. I do know they said they first went to Adel. Maybe they had found out that, there was a need for brick masons, or maybe architects in Adel, and I know they did come to Adel, Georgia, and then they came to Thomasville, and they liked Thomasville, and they settled here. And then my mother was a teacher. She was a home economics teacher at Hampton Institute.
And
And
where
then she was a music teacher.
Virginia.
So,
Virginia?
uh-huh.
And
no,
did-
so, uh-huh.
And
So
did she
when
teach here?
Yeah, she taught at the parochial school, the Good Shepherd Episcopal Parochial School is where she taught.
And she taught what there?
She taught first grade and kindergarten for a number of years. During the time when I was in college, I went to the parochial school for 4 years. Then I had a choice. I decided to go to Allenama, so I said I wanted to go to Allenama, so I would have to walk from East Jackson Street over there on Leicester Street to Allenama School until it closed in 1933. And then I went to Douglas. So I graduated from Douglas in 37. Then I went to Raleigh, North Carolina to the St. Augustine's College. That was an Episcopal college for 2 years. Then I came back and I got a job at Brooks County for about 2 years. And at that time you could get a provisional certificate if you didn't have 4 years. And I worked in Brooks County. Then I worked for a couple of years. Then Miss Chappelle, who was the supervisor, asked me to work in Thomas County. And then she encouraged me to go back to school. So I would, like Miss Greene said, take it piece by piece. I would go in the summer to Albany State. And I finished Albany State. But see, I had married and had a family then. And my mother had died. My father had gone to Alabama. And he was working, and he helped build the Oak Ridge Center out from Knoxville, Tennessee during the war. He worked there, and then after he retired from there, he came into the city and worked in the vocational school, teaching brick masonry to the young men in Knoxville, Tennessee, and he died, and he's buried in Knoxville, Tennessee. But I got married and went to New York and stayed, and my mother got sick, and I came home, and my daughter was born, and I stayed here. My husband was working at the Three Toms Inn then. I met him, and I stayed in the home house because they had worked too hard to try to have a place for us to stay. See, Mama didn't follow Daddy. She stayed home, and he had to go out of town to get work. But, you know, they had books and newspapers, and they encouraged us. And I had a brother that died early. He was 28 when he died. There were just 2 of us. But then I'm right there in the home house where I was born.
During that period, blacks had an insatiable appetite for learning.
That's right. They really did.
They had an insatiable, and some of the greatest people, many of whom will not be recorded in the history books.
Right.
If you just don't hear people tell you about them,
That's exactly
you would
right.
never know them. Some of the greatest heroes,
Who were they?
they are numerous.
And then this,
Others will just have
the
to
blacks in
think, yeah.
Thomasville have always been for education and cultural things. They used to, when the Fisk Jubilee singers would travel, and I was a young child then, but they would have them come every year, and they would be up to St. Thomas Methodist Church, and every year these singers would come. See, and that was cultural activities that they would bring into the
They were
community for
famous.
the
The
blacks.
Fisk Jubilee singers,
I've heard of them.
Yeah,
Yes,
the Fisk
that
Jubilee singers, they were
Yeah.
great singers. Oh yeah, and they used to come, they would travel all over the South, you know, getting funds for the school and helping the school. And they would give concerts. It was beautiful.
you know, that has not been too long ago. You know, it seems
No, it
all of these
just
things.
yesterday.
Just yesterday.
Tell me about professional blacks here.
I'd like to say this before we close.
Oh, yes, ma'am.
professional blacks.
That I taught French and English for 40 years. Then when I retired, I did substitute work for 12 years. So finally I decided that the kids are different now. And I guess I better give it up.
Not the hunger for learning
Yeah.
that there had been.
There's a little lady, Miss Kitty Hamilton. You were asking about the professional
Yes.
blacks. Miss Kitty Hamilton and Mrs. Young.
Yeah.
What was
Frankie
that?
Young.
Frankie
That's what I'm
Young.
talking
Those
about.
are some of the early educators and numerous others
Especially
You know
having
some of the
one
others, Miss
his
Brown? Yeah.
father, church that
Yes,
Spalding got it
that's
started.
right. And you had outstanding religious leaders also. Reverend Rulac,
Yeah.
your Presbyterian minister here was that, Father Perry,
Andrew Young.
Andrew Young. Yeah, that was in my time. But
Yes.
if you want to go way back. But the amazing thing is that there were so many outstanding people right around the turn of the century.
What caused
Dr.
that?
Dr. Wilson, whom my friend Mildred Newton tells me so much about. His home is on South Street, a beautiful columned home. He was a physician, and he also had a drugstore on Jackson Street. And of course, Dr. Patton. Dr. Patton was a walking doctor,
Yeah,
wasn't he?
walking doctor.
Yes, he walked everywhere, I have heard.
Never had that.
And of course, you know the names of some of the other doctors. Who
Yeah.
remember? How many do you remember?
Dr. Wilson.
Dr. Mosley, yes.
I remember him.
It says here that his practice was on Remington Avenue.
Dr. Mosley. Yes. And of course, there were others whom I don't know, but I've
Yeah.
heard.
What about
mention of them.
attorneys? Were
We
there
didn't
many
have
black
any
attorneys?
I don't recall any black attorneys in here, do you?
Now, that is one thing we're just
Yeah.
missing.
No, we don't. We didn't have any black attorneys. No
What about
Well,
insurance?
we had one recently.
Now we had insurance.
Insurance is
collectors.
big stuff.
Yeah,
for blacks.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, Allied, North Carolina Mutual, Pilgrim,
Afro-American,
Afro-American,
Right,
right.
right.
We had plenty of insurance companies.
Central.
They had offices down on West Jackson Street, you know, in that area down there that's all closed up now. But they had offices down there. And then we had Mr. Tillman, who was
Shoemaker.
shoemaker, right. Mr. Tillman was down there. Then we had Mr. Corbett as a cafe. He had a cafe down there. Mr. Smith, after he left. Then we
Mr.
had
Hill, Elijah Hill's father.
Elijah Hill, right. You had Miss
Haddocks, Mr.
Miss
Haddocks.
Haddocks, who had a restaurant down there. Now, I was real young,
Yeah.
but she had a restaurant down on West Jackson Street. My mother used to take me down to see her when I was a child. She would go visit her. But that, you know, that's what we do in the summertime, go and visit these people down on West Jackson Street.
The social center was Dockett's Drugstore
That's right.
And where was Dockett's Drugstore on Jackson?
on Jackson Street, where the old theater.
Where the Ritz is now?
Yes, it's right next to the
Right
Ritz.
next to
Is that the
Ritz.
vacant lot?
Yes, it's
Okay.
vacant now. It's not the vacant lot. I mean,
not the vacant lot.
I mean, nobody's
That's
in
on
it.
the corner,
Yeah,
right, the
yeah.
theater there,
Yeah.
but Dockett's was right next to it. I think
Yeah.
that's a vacant
Okay.
store.
I don't mean a vacant lot. The store is vacant now.
Okay.
That's the vacancy I was talking about.
That was it.
Yes, but there were numerous people, and there was an outstanding restaurant I have heard about, Mr. McGuire's restaurant.
Yeah, right, I remember
Which was-
that.
Where was
Yeah,
that?
That
Mrs.
was on
Murray?
South
On
Street.
South Street,
Yeah, that was on South, that wasn't even downtown.
where the elite would eat.
Yeah, but that was Mr. Wright, Mr. McGuire, I
Was that
remember
his, was that his motto, where the elite would eat?
No, but Thomasville had quite a class system among the
Yeah,
blacks.
they did, they sure did.
Tell me about that.
Yes. Well, it seems to me from what I've heard that it was divided by the kind of work you did, the church that you belonged to, and the education that you had.
That's right.
It was structured along the same lines, I guess, as any class system. And of course, Thomasville had one.
And where did the Plantation black community fall within that hierarchy?
Well, in
They
some
were
instances,
there
they
by
were high up on,
themselves. Yeah, they were by themselves.
They could
were
move in and out.
plantation people. Right,
Yeah.
and the plantation people took care of them, so,
Yeah.
you know, they didn't bother with
But as
the
far as
people.
the social hierarchy was concerned, I think many plantation people found a place
Yeah,
in all of the levels.
yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Because, you know, when you talk about plantations, it's very significant to know that we are not talking about plantations as most people perceive it and as the dictionary gives it. These were estates.
Right.
And we can't say too much about the outstanding contributions that these northerners made to the progress and development of the whole region, including the people, especially the blacks. Because had it not been for them, I don't think many blacks would have had the educational opportunities they subsequently had.
That's right.
In fact, they gave opportunities to people to work and make enough money
To send
to send their kids to school, many of whom
Right.
acquired their own property because they had regular salaries.
Right.
I have heard that Thomasville was a hard place for black people during the 20s.
Why was
There was
that?
very little work.
Their little
Everybody was
right,
competing for
uh-huh.
a few jobs. Now, the major kinds of work I have heard that blacks were successful in were in the well, as artisans. There were black professionals. You had some teachers. You had doctors. Yes, and you had mailmen and railroad men
Like Mr.
and
Quinn?
entrepreneurs. Plenty of businesses were here compared to, other places. You had a haberdashery on Jackson Street, I understand. All of the dry cleaning for the city was done by a black businessman. You had there's an architect. Ornatha just got through telling me about her daddy. And you had grocers. You had grocers. And you had cafes. A lot of these businesses flourished because these were places where blacks could get service.
That's true.
Yes.
That's right.
And so you had businesses which served the black community
Yeah, you had dry cleaners.
exclusively?
That's right.
You had a lot of dry cleaning establishments. Yes. And some of these jobs, such as railroad jobs and mail carriers, were predominantly black.
Why was that? Do you know?
Well, I guess like in most instances when jobs kind of carry a lot of kind of drudgery, black folks always got them.
Right.
And then when the jobs became lucrative, they kind of moved out. And of course that trend seems to be with us forever. But it was certainly prevalent then, I have heard. And I have seen it in my lifetime. As soon as it starts paying a lot of money, well, it becomes a competitive thing. But blacks survived. They really did. And they prospered, it seems to me, in a climate of obstacles. I think that so many people now don't work really hard enough to overcome. And despite all we might say, we have made tremendous progress. I was just reading an article in the Atlanta Constitution today, and I just jotted down some statistics. Since the revolution of the 60s, over the past 30 years, it's been 30 years since that time, 1/2 of all black families will bring home more than $25,000 a year. There has been a growing middle class. And 1 in 3 black families will bring home over $50,000 a year. And there are numerous black families who are way above that. And there have been tremendous gains among the middle class blacks. I think that is one of the reasons why so many people who are not familiar with the black middle class and those for whom the black middle class is not so visible see only those who are in the newspapers daily for drugs, for theft.
It's
They see only the pregnant girls.
like teenagers. They only make the
Teenagers.
news if they've done something.
That's right. That's right. In fact, you see the welfare people, and of course all welfare people are not people to be scorned, but some of them are people who have not made it in the society, and much of the reason can be attributed to themselves, to them, rather than to the society. In 1963, roughly 250,000 of blacks were in colleges and universities. 250,000. That's about 250,000, right? In 1993, there are more than 4 times that many in colleges and universities. 30 years ago, only 300 black elected officials prevailed throughout the United States. Today, in 1993, there are 7,000. Okay? So that is progress. Those are just a few of the categories. In many other categories, blacks have made tremendous advancements. Of course, we have to give credit to those early civil rights pioneers, many of whom started before Martin Luther King. Some of these people we're talking about now were great fighters for justice and for rights. But we must remember that we were operating in a climate in which the government was against us, was against our progress. It was the law.
That's right.
It was the law to segregate. It was the law to deny.
What were the laws
Yes.
in Thomasville? How were you segregated in Thomasville?
No, honey.
You were segregated by national law, by state law.
I stayed walking distance from East Side School, and I couldn't even go there. And I had to walk to Douglas, which was over a mile, walk to Eleanor, which was a mile, over a mile, and right there at it. There were drugstores here where you could go and you couldn't, they would have fountains, and we would trade with them. I remember my daddy traded with one, and he had a fountain, but we couldn't go in and sit down and have a soda or anything like that.
Do you know that in the 1940s, you couldn't go into public libraries? There were no public library facilities. Can you imagine that?
I couldn't even go to the library when I was a child.
No, you couldn't go into a library.
So how was it when integration came? How did you feel about having access to things that had been forbidden before?
I felt that it should have been that way all the time. I always thought it was stupid to have this for me and this for you. I always thought that I just couldn't see the reasoning why you had to have a white school, have a black school, take the tax money, build two schools, when you could have one school, everybody could go together just like they're doing now. I
thought that too.
I just thought it was plain stupid.
But you know why we thought that?
We abided by the law. Now that's one thing we did. We
abided by the law. But you know why we thought
by the law? But we didn't like it, and we thought it was foolish.
We thought it was foolish.
It was a foolish thing.
And I grew up on this menu. You are just as good as anybody else.
That's what I grew up with.
That people who do these things to you are foolish. They are not God-fearing people. And I believe that. I bought into that. And we were protected from a lot of the embarrassments and a lot of the hurts. I came from a very protective environment. I went off to boarding school. We had our own community there on the college.
No, this person, because they didn't let you do this. You don't go around hating people. You have more sense. There's no difference between you and me. Only the color of your skin, and that does not matter. We all God's children, and we all the same in God's sight. So you just do the best you can, and live the best life you can, and treat your fellow man right.
That's what your mother and father taught you. Our schools taught us that. The ministers taught us that.
You got that message.
Yeah, you got the message. And so you never learned to hate.
You never learned to hate.
I didn't grow up in an environment where hate was nurtured.
That's great. Ladies, I appreciate it, and I've certainly enjoyed this.
We've enjoyed it too.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nancy. We enjoyed it too.